Very often when I talk about preaching and worship, I talk about doing the work of worship. Today during this sermon time, I'm going to ask you to do a little extra work. This is going to be a hard one, okay? Listen hard. As many of you know, the Riverside Church is home to the Weekday School. It's a neighborhood nursery school that was founded in the 1930s here at the church, long before early childhood education was in vogue. Every year, the Weekday School holds a themed gala when all the parents and the teachers and the pastor dress up and raise money for scholarships for the school. As I was heading out to the gala a few weeks ago, my 21-year-old daughter, Hannah, who happened to be at my apartment, inspected my outfit, as she is wont to do. Looking me up and down with her critical eye, she said dubiously, "What is the theme this year?" "The Love Boat," I said, glancing down at my sequined dress that I was sure fit the bill. "What's that?" she said. For those of you who do not know, The Love Boat was a television series that ran on ABC for about 10 years in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s. It was set on a big luxury cruise ship called the SS Pacific Princess, and I don't really know what it was about because my mother would never let us watch it. But even though we kids were banished from the living room when my grandmother watched it, we could still hear that telltale theme song that signaled the beginning of the show, which I can still sing, and I bet you can too. The Love Boat is what comes to mind when I think of a huge boat on which one might live for 40 days and 40 nights, surrounded by cute animals and all the people you love. Noah and the Ark, the iconic biblical story. I mean, it was a long time ago, so it probably didn't have a casino like the SS Pacific Princess, but you know what I mean. Contributing to my rather shallow impressions of the story of Noah and the Ark are, of course, all the Sunday school murals and children's books and nursery wallpaper and baby blankets and stuffed toys and crib decor that I chose for my own children, all of which told the story we all know. A story of a time when there was a bad flood, and a man named Noah, who was smart, built a boat onto which he loaded his whole family and every single animal in pairs, and they floated off on the water until the flood was over, and there was a rainbow, and God made a promise never to flood the earth again. But while I liberally decorated my baby's nurseries with printed and stuffed representations of this biblical story, I realized this week that I have never preached this text. One reason for that, I suppose, is that the story of Noah and the ark, condensed in our reading today from Genesis chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, does not appear anywhere in our 3-year cycle of assigned text in its entirety. It's very long. Today, in fact, and for all the season of Lent this year, we're taking a detour away from the assigned Hebrew text and telling stories from the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. Another reason I've never preached this text is because if you sit down and you read all of Genesis chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, you will soon discover that the story of Noah and the ark is, well, pretty much a terrible story. It's actually horrible. It is not one you would want to preach, and it's definitely not one you want to decorate your kid's nursery with. For one thing, the plotline centers around a natural disaster that destroys the entire world. For another, the behavior of humanity before, during, and after the flood is basically despicable. And God? Well, God is a terrible character in this story. This week I finally figured out why I never preached this text. Because you and I read and study Scripture to learn about God, about how God interacts with the world and with humanity, about how we interact with God and with each other, scholars have been arguing forever about this text. Because the things we learn about God and about humanity in this text are not very flattering for either. The one thing we can be definitely sure of from this text is that God is male. I mean, just look at how emotional he gets here. He creates the world, including human beings. Human beings misbehave. He uses the word corrupt. God gets mad, but not just mad, I mean really, really mad. God regrets even creating human beings in the first place. And the text doesn't quite say it like this, but you kind of get the impression that God does something like fling an arm across a tabletop and send the dishes flying, or throw a coffee mug across the room and use some choice words that your mother would wash your mouth out with soap for using. I'm just kidding about God being male, of course. Some scholars hypothesize that we are watching God evolve here, grow and change, as one does in any relationship. You can't live in human society without living in relationships, so everyone sitting in this room will understand when I talk about human relationships evolving. Think about, say, your relationship with your parents. When you're a little kid, your relationship with your parents is different than when you're a teenager, or when you become a parent yourself, or when your parents begin to age. Some say that God is feeling the growing pains here. Like, the cute little things he created are suddenly growing into these gangly, disrespectful, foreign-looking beings, and God just doesn't know quite how to deal with that. In fact, one of the most difficult things about this text is how much it anthropomorphizes God. That is, it applies all of these human characteristics to God. So when we read this text, we're not surprised that human beings sin and are corrupt. We know that happens all the time. But does God really get angry? Does God regret decisions God makes? Does God change God's mind? Does God play favorites? And is God sometimes so unable to control God's anger that God spins out of control and destroys everything on a whim? Well, that's not very appropriate for the mural in the church nursery. Thankfully for us, we're not about the task of parsing the text in 60 minutes today to understand the character of God in its entirety. This is the season of Lent, and this Lent, we're thinking about sin and loss. So as we read this story, we're trying to listen for what the sin is and listen for what is lost here. The text is pretty clear that the sin of humanity here is corruption across the board. But we know that that ball already started rolling way back in the garden, and it just kept getting worse. God is fed up with humanity. And what we seem to have lost in this story is the benefit of the doubt. So what are we left with? We are left with a big mess. There are some people in the boat and a lot of people outside the boat. There are damaged survivors and a God who regrets everything, a world that is bruised, and a relationship between the Creator and the created that is barely hanging on by a thread. It seems that in humanity's relationship with God, we used to have the benefit of the doubt. We used to walk freely in a beautiful garden where every little thing we needed to flourish was available to us. And not just to us, to every creature living in the garden with us. God walked in the garden with us and assumed naturally that we'd care for it and for all the living creatures that inhabited it. And God didn't even think to wonder whether all the living creatures would get along, because God knew that we were created to be in relationship with one another. Of course, we would love and respect each other, wanting and working for each other's best interests above even our own. And God walked in the garden with us. God didn't install surveillance cameras or hire security guards or ratify a Second Amendment. There wasn't any need to do that sort of thing because the relationship we shared was one of mutual accountability, love, respect. But somewhere along the way, we lost the benefit of the doubt. Like a parent lying in bed and counting the minutes past curfew, waiting to hear the creak of an errant floorboard as the teenager tries to sneak in. God was fed up, done. Something changed when we sinned. Something was lost. And the benefit of the doubt wasn't just lost between us and God. It was lost between us and each other, too. Furious at all of humanity, God looked across the whole earth, and only Noah found favor in God's sight, the text says. So Noah, following God's advice, built a boat and loaded his family and animals on the boat. And when the rain started to fall, he pulled up the gangplank, and as he did, you know he must have looked out and seen his neighbors standing there watching him. Perhaps with a mixture of curiosity and maybe a little bit of growing panic. From inside the boat, his family battened the hatches and hunkered down to ride out the storm, but even the pounding of the rain and the crashing of the waves could not cover the cries of terror from the people with whom Noah and his family had farmed and worshiped and traded and lived a life. Their neighbors. How can a human being do something like that? Well, the only way to do something like that is to harden your heart to the pain of another by making a fellow human being into an other, by deciding that somehow I am fundamentally better, more worthy than you are, by closing my heart and by locking away the benefit of the doubt. Of course, it starts small, with an unkind word or a malicious rumor. But you and I know full well it doesn't stop there. It becomes broken relationships, lost friendships, lawsuits, divorces, civil wars, world wars. It grows into permanence memorialized in the prison industrial complex and institutional gender bias. It's slavery and genocide and the Holocaust and human trafficking. And this week, it marched itself out onto the world stage, white supremacy dressed up yet again with automatic weapons in a place of worship. When the waters receded and the bottom of the boat scraped a mountaintop and wedged itself to a standstill, Noah and his family and all of the animals eventually came out of the boat, back to a world that had changed forever. Hear me again. The story you learned in Sunday school is not true. I hate to ruin it for you, but if you keep reading beyond the stop of the rain, you will see that it does not end as beautifully as you might have imagined. Noah and his family had lost so much by then. Here's what was left: decay, desolation, mud, mold, smell, death, poisoned earth, devastated civilization, survivor's guilt, broken hearts, PTSD, trauma, fear, so many questions. Indeed, Noah's pain and doubt quickly led to an internal family conflict that was the seed of tribal and national enmity that would plague Israel to this very day, until today. This was no Love Boat cruise. Everything about this story leaves us wanting. It's a mess. Sin and loss everywhere you turn. So why even try? The history of humanity is littered with story after story after story of sin and loss, and more sin and loss. The exercise of being redemptively human seems distinctly futile this week and every week. What's the point? Well, I wonder if maybe the point is this: we're still here. After all the devastation and pain and sin and loss, we're still here. The first thing that Noah does when he steps off the ark is to build an altar and pray. And in the world in which we live, where evil and white supremacy now blatantly creates devastation and mess, Oak Creek Sikh Temple, Mother Emanuel AME Church, the Islamic Center of Quebec City, Tree of Life Synagogue, and this week Christ Church Mosque. And the sun rose over the horizon this morning, and you got up and you made your way here to a holy space where we gather to be together, to care for each other, to live in relationship with the divine who we don't understand, to clean up the mess and to keep trying. You're still here. I'm still here. A lot of us have survivor's guilt and broken hearts and PTSD and trauma and fear and so many questions. But there is something inside of us that is longing for the divine, that's crying out, say something. I don't want to give up on you, God. We don't want to give up on each other either. In the end, we're still here, muddling through it all. Our relationships with God, our relationships with each other. We may have lost the benefit of the doubt, but we haven't lost God, and we haven't lost one another, and that is something. Today, the story of Noah, a terrible story of anger and destruction and chaos and division, and one more chance to try again. We're worse for the wear, but we are still here. And so we don't give up. Amen.